Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's INSEAD Tech Talk. I'm Medha Datar, a current MBA student, and I'll be your host for this session. Today's webinar is part of the Tech Talk series by Digital at INSEAD, where we deep dive into the paradox of digitization and content novelty. I'd also like to extend a special thank you to our sponsor, Accenture, for their support. Before we dive into today's topic, let me go over a few housekeeping points. The audience is muted and video and chat functions are disabled. If you have questions, please use the Q&A tab. To help us identify the most relevant ones, you can vote on existing questions. This webinar is being recorded and will be shared on our official YouTube channel. Finally, if you encounter any technical issues, you can email us at digital@insead.edu. Today's webinar will focus on presenting the paradox of digitization and content novelty. Welcome, Manav and Khwan.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Manav Raj. I'm an assistant professor in the management department at Wharton. I'm excited to share this project co-authored with Khwan on digitization and content novelty in the context of the book industry. So just to start, before we dive into the presentation itself, we wanted to share a poll question to bring you guys into the research and to get a little bit of a sense of what you guys might think about what we were studying. So the question that we're going to ask is, how has digital publishing changed your perception of content originality? You can see the answers below. We look forward to seeing your kind of perspective on this as well. With that, I'll share my screen and we'll dive into the slides that I have. It should be sharing now. I'm assuming you guys can see it, unless I get any feedback that it's not. So I'll just go ahead and dive forward. So this is a working paper with Khwan, as I mentioned. We started on it maybe a few years ago. What we are focused on here is understanding how digitization affects content novelty and a study of the book industry. We know from our own experiences as well as academic research that digitization has greatly altered the landscape of creative content. So these are figures from this article by Joel Waldfogel, who is an economist studying digitization, who talks about digitization creating a golden age of music, movies, books, and television. We know that there are more songs to listen to than ever before, more movies produced, more books and more TV shows. This probably, accords with our own experiences of being inundated with content across all of these different channels. And this is something that we see talked about in the public press as well. So this is an article from Forbes from a few years ago that talks about how power is shifting in entertainment as digitization has changed the market. The old Hollywood model is fundamentally outdated. Today, the power to produce and publish content across platforms lies in the hands of independent creators. And we all, as consumers of creative goods, know that the ways in which we consume the content has also changed as well. Now, while we know that we have more access to creative goods than ever before, it's not immediately clear how the nature of these goods have changed. A take espoused by some of the entrepreneurs that have spearheaded some of these changes is that digitization has led to an increase in the novelty of content and has enabled greater creativity than ever before. So if we look at Jeff Bezos, who, of course, the CEO of Amazon, but led the push of digitization in the book industry with the Kindle and the Kindle marketplace, talks about with the Kindle, even the improbable ideas can get tried because there are no expert gatekeepers ready to say that will never work. Similarly, if we look at Daniel Ek from Spotify, he talks about the mission of Spotify is to inspire human creativity by enabling 1 million artists to be able to live off of their art. So the idea behind some of these sentiments is that by opening these doors and by allowing all this content to enter, we should see more novelty, more improbable ideas, more creativity enter into the market. However, there is an opposing take that digitization may actually serve to stifle novelty. You can see headlines that look like how Spotify's algorithms are ruining music, why TikTok has everyone talking and acting the same, or from The Guardian, this headline, ebooks are stupid and that they have no creativity. This is a topic and a question that we think has a lot of interest amongst society as well. I'll show you guys some articles that pop up, but in our own conversations and in our own experiences as consumers, Khwan and I have noticed that there is this sense that, hey, is culture slowing down in some ways? We have so much content out here, but how do we sort through these things? And we think this is an interesting and important question to study both kind of practically and in terms of research. To fully understand how digitization is affecting the production of creative goods, we need to understand not just how it changes the volume of what is produced. Yes, there is way more stuff than ever before, but also it's important to understand how it changes the nature of what is produced. And by studying novelty, we are examining a critical dimension of the strategies of creative producers, which is how differentiated a product is relative to its peer. So the research question that is at the heart of this study is, how does digitization affect the novelty of creative products? And just to be really specific about what exactly we'll be studying, and of course, Khwan is going to go into more detail in the back half of this presentation, I want to define these terms a little bit. When we're thinking about digitization, we are thinking about it at the market level, affecting both supply and demand side. And so, as we think about digitization, let's say in the book industry, we know that it's affected how books are supplied through self-publishing, through the ability to work around kind of traditional gatekeepers and publishers, has made it easier for authors and editors to bring books to market, so affecting, again, the supply side of the market. And we also know that it's affected the demand side of the market. If we think about how we search for, evaluate, and purchase books, we can now take advantage of platforms like Amazon and Kindle. We can take advantage of review aggregators like Goodreads, and we may even be reading books on platforms like the Kindle and through digital services. So our conception of digitization is relatively broad, and what we'll try and do is start with this broad conception, and then, as we move throughout this presentation, try and get at which of these forces may be more or less important in documenting the results. And when we're thinking about novelty, the way that we're going to conceptualize it is by thinking about the product level differentiation of creative content relative to prior products. So we'll be thinking about, for a given book, how similar to or different from is it relative to other books that have been released in the past, 3 years, 5 years, etc. Now, before I kind of summarize what we're doing here and why we think there could be reasons to expect results in both directions, I want to spend an extra minute talking about why we think this is an important and interesting question. From a practitioner's perspective, we think the study has actionable implications for producers of creative goods. We know that creative producers may find that they benefit from deploying novel or different strategies as the market changes around them. And we've seen that in the context of digitization as well. So for example, the rise of Spotify and the streaming business model has led to interesting changes in the music industry. One of the headlines I've kind of put on this slide is about a band called Wolfpack, which made a completely silent album, asked their fans to stream this 5-minute album to generate money for tour. And this was really effective for them, right? An extremely quick and easy album to produce, made them $20,000, generated a lot of publicity. Something that would not have necessarily worked in a pre-digitization era, but was tailored for the Spotify business model. And more broadly, we see that over time, song length has fallen as digitization has increased, as artists are more concerned about acquiring streams and accumulating stream counts rather than monetary sales. So in a similar vein, our results may inform us how creative producers may want to position themselves relative to their peers in a digitized market. And, we also think this matters for society. So as I mentioned, we think there are some of these conversations floating around about culture and about creativity. This article in the top left, Is Popular Culture Really in Terminal Decline?, was published in The Atlantic yesterday. So this is, very timely. I think this is a really interesting article, and I think it speaks to a lot of what we do. So I'd recommend it as reading after the webinar if you're interested in this topic. But there are a lot of these kind of perspectives that are asking, are we seeing changes in creativity? Are we seeing changes in the ways that creative goods and cultural products are being brought to market and being enjoyed? And we believe our research has the ability to speak to some of these perspectives and perhaps shed light on one reason why we have seen some of the changes that we have in cultural markets. Further, we think it matters for consumers as well. As I mentioned, we know we have access to more creative goods than ever before. But, just because we have access to all of these goods doesn't mean that we get to enjoy all of them. And as many of us know, there's a cognitive load to sorting through all the products and goods around us. So we think by adding some nuance around what the average creative product looks like, we can help us understand what the consumer experience might be as well. Okay. So with that as the backdrop, I want to dive into talking a little bit about the theory behind the project, and specifically speak a little bit about how we are thinking about digitization in this research and what the extant literature would tell us about how digitization affects creative industries. So as I mentioned, we're thinking about digitization as consisting of various components. So you can think about in creative industries, we have digital production tools like Kindle Direct Publishing in the book industry or GarageBand that change how we are producing creative goods. We have digital distribution channels that allow producers to take the goods and bring them to consumers. So things like the Kindle store in the book industry or Netflix in a streaming context. And we have online consumer evaluation aggregators or information intermediaries that help us sort through and evaluate different offerings. So again, in the book industry, we can think about Goodreads. In the movie industry, you could think about IMDb or things like that. And what we know from external research that's out there is digitization has greatly altered how content is produced, distributed, evaluated, and consumed. And in talking through this, I want to separate this out by thinking about changes on the supply side and the demand side. On the supply side, we know that digitization has lowered the costs of producing and distributing content. So it's made it much easier for people to bring goods to market. And it has also allowed producers to bypass gatekeepers and lower barriers to entry. So if I want to write a book right now, I don't need to worry about finding a publisher to produce it and to distribute it. I could do it through the Kindle Direct Publishing. If I wanted to release an album, I could record it on GarageBand and put it up on Spotify by the end of the day today. It's a very different model than what we have been used to in the past. On the demand side, digitization has also elicited changes in our behavior as consumers. First of all, it increases the range of products and information about products available to consumers. When we think about entering a bookstore in the late 90s, let's say, a store can only contain so much inventory. But if we are buying books on Amazon or on the Kindle Marketplace, there is basically an unlimited amount of content that they can offer to us. And similarly, the information is far greater than ever before as well, right? So while previously we might have relied really heavily on what the New York Times reviews were or bestseller lists, now, I can go to Goodreads and I can go to Amazon and I can really directly and granularly search for the kind of things that I want to look for and I think I would enjoy. This diminishes the role of traditional intermediaries in evaluating products. Now, for these kind of reasons that I'm documenting, we know that digitization in creative industries causes firms to alter their strategies. So research that has studied music and movies and books suggests that digitization can lead to producers targeting new market segments and changing their positioning. Now, we're going to extend this work to consider how digitization may affect the novelty of creative goods. And, we think novelty is a really interesting and important dependent variable here and outcome to focus on for two reasons. One, when we think about creative industries and we think about creativity itself, novelty is at the heart of that. Oftentimes in the literature, creativity is defined as the combination of novelty and usefulness. And so being distinct and being differentiated is a really key part of what we think of as being creative. And so we think it's important to understand the nature of these kind of shifts in the industry. In more of a strategic way, novelty is also is a really key strategic action because it's product differentiation, right? How do you position yourself relative to the peers around you? This is important in all industries, not just creative industries, but even in this space, it's something that really matters and really may determine how successful a producer is. A priori, we could imagine that there are reasons to expect either that digitization may have either a positive or a negative effect on novelty. And we alluded to those reasons a little bit in the introduction here, thinking about some of these quotes and some of the kind of lay knowledge around this. And, even looking at the poll results, I can see that we have a little bit of a split, in what people might expect. Digitization could increase novelty for a few reasons. One, reduced barriers to entry could increase artistic autonomy. So now artists are free to do whatever they would like. Maybe they pursue their wackier, zanier, more creative ideas. It can create opportunities for broader recombination for producers, authors, editors, songwriters to mix and match concepts from different domains and perhaps have a little bit more boundary spanning that looks a little bit more novel. And it can allow us as consumers to find long tail offerings, find niche, more creative things that perhaps we couldn't access before. By creating a market for such goods, we may incentivize producers that previously, due to the monetary incentives, might have preferred more to create more mainstream products. Now, we also could expect that digitization might decrease novelty for a few reasons. Reduced barriers to entry may also lead to easier entry for derivative work. So, we could have more entry by low quality publishers. I mentioned if I wanted to put up an album on Spotify, I could do so today. If I did that, it wouldn't be a very good album, so there's kind of that trade-off that is there as well. While gatekeepers may limit the entry of content, in other ways, they may also identify, develop, and promote novelty and quality. And as many of us know from our own experiences, within these kind of digital platforms and within these kind of information intermediaries, there can oftentimes be algorithmic echo chambers where algorithms and digital search tools push us towards things that we already know and like and limit our ability to explore and experience new or novel things. So given that we may expect either effect, this positive or this negative effect, what we're going to do is take a relatively open-ended approach. We're going to we'll first document the relationship between digitization and content novelty in the book industry at large. And Khwan will walk through how we do this. We're going to try and get at it in a few different angles to try and really convince you that we are seeing the relationship that we think we are seeing. And then what we're going to do is kind of try and disentangle this relationship a little bit to identify the mechanisms underlying the relationship. So again, as I mentioned, we conceptualize digitization and we measure it in a very broad way, but there are a lot of different moving parts here. So we want to try and understand what part of this is maybe driven by changes in the supply side, the production processes, and what of it may be also affected by changes on the demand side and how consumers are searching for, evaluating, and consuming offerings. We'll then try and kind of bring our results together to give you guys some takeaways regarding how digitization affects content production in creative industries. One thing I do want to be clear about is our main analyses and the results that we'll present is really going to be focused on how does the novelty of the average book change as digitization increases. But one thing that we'll try and talk about towards the end of the presentation is, how can we bridge these average effects with what is happening at the market level, right? So even if the average novelty is changing, but we have way more books than ever before, those are interesting empirical facts to reconcile, and we'll talk through what that means for the marketplace as well. So I'll end with a really quick preview of the research before I hand off to Khwan to dive into things in more details. So we'll study the relationship between digitization and content novelty in the context of the US book industry using data from 2004 to 2014. We're going to use natural language processing techniques to measure the content novelty of a large sample of books that are published both in print and virtually based on one paragraph summaries of the book. What you can think of as these are the kind of back cover descriptions that provide us with a sense of the content of each book. We're going to measure digitization using the diffusion of the ebook format. We'll use genre level variation in ebook diffusion and a difference in differences identification strategy, basically leveraging the staggered rollout of the Kindle marketplace in the United States relative to Europe to examine the relationship between digitization and content novelty in the book industry. And what we're going to find is a negative relationship that's quite strong and quite persistent. So again, to contextualize it, we're seeing more work than ever before, and even more in terms of volume novel work, but on average, novelty appears to fall. And then what we're going to do is present some evidence that suggests that this relationship is driven by both supply and demand side factors. So on the supply side, the effects are greater for self-published books and for new entrants, which may lead us to believe that lower barriers to entry and reduced role of editorial gatekeeping is pushing this in some ways, is leading to less novelty. However, what we find is that also the books produced by big name authors and big publishers also experience a decrease in novelty. And looking at the demand side, what we see is that in terms of consumer ratings, the number and the quality of consumer ratings, novelty is increasingly punished as digitization increases. So we may see that producers are incentivized to produce slightly more derivative work as digitization increases. So that's all I have, and that's kind of the high-level summary of this work. With that, I'll hand off to Khwan to kind of dive into things in more detail.
All right, thank you, Manav. I'm assuming everyone can see my screen and hear my voice. Okay, hi everyone. My name is Khwan Kim. I'm a PhD candidate in management at INSEAD. I'll be joining UCL School of Management as an assistant professor this summer. My research generally covers creativity and innovation in cultural industries, including the book publishing industry, films and music, and contemporary art. From this slide onward, I'll be talking mostly about how we tested and explored our research questions empirically and what kind of result we were able to draw. Okay, first, what kind of data did we use to test our questions? I'm pretty sure a lot of people in this room are already using or have at least heard of this platform, Goodreads.com. We use Goodreads.com as the primary data source, and we collected a very detailed information on at least 300,000 original books published during our observation period, which is between 2000 and 2014. And as the performance measure, we additionally collected the New York Times bestseller list. And we also conducted open-ended interviews to better understand the context. So using these data sets we collected, we constructed these dozens of interesting variables, but as you can guess, the most critical variable we had to construct was content novelty. How do we measure content novelty? If you have already used Goodreads.com, you can always check this couple of paragraphs of textual content about the book. Obviously, it doesn't let you know the entire content, but you can easily gauge what kind of topics will be there and what kind of characters, what will be the plot. So we first extracted these textual descriptions and used this deep learning algorithm called BERT to convert this text into numerical vectors. Once we have these vectorized items in this latent vector space, as you can see, we can easily compute the distance between these dots. These individual dots in this space represent all these distinct books in our data set. So basically, content novelty in our research is measured as the cosine distance between a focal book and then the average vector of all the other books published in the past 5 years within the same genre. Let me give you an example. Let's imagine I'm a romance book author, and I just published a book about some romance, and it turned out to be a very unique and atypical romance story. Then because of that uniqueness of my content, my book will be located far from this cluster at the corner right here. And the average vector of the other cluster will be at the center. And this means that I'll be having a quite far distance between me and the average vector, giving me a high novelty score. Whereas if my book is about a very typical and traditional and conventional love story, then I'll be located very close to the average vector. And therefore, I'm going to be assigned a low novelty. I'd like to acknowledge that we know that this measure is not perfect, of course. It's a very coarse measure that sacrifices some nuanced aspect of book content, including stylistic uniqueness or character development across a narrative. But we believe that at least it can capture a more or less topical novelty precisely. And let's do some. Let's look at some examples and how we validated this content novelty measure based on our vectorization. As a first practice, we first picked very famous two books, one from fiction and the other from nonfiction. I'm pretty sure everyone knows The Devil's Wears Prada or the Steve Jobs biography, and try to see whether our vectorization method can identify the most similar and the least similar books to each of these focal books. And this is the result. According to our vectorization method, Another novel about this young woman with an emerging career, living in a big city, New York City, trying to navigate her life and friendship, is identified as the most similar to The Devil Wears Prada. And the other book here, Outlander, whose book cover already reveals some distance, is identified as the least similar to the focal book here. And on the right-hand side, as you can see, for the Steve Jobs biography, another Steve Jobs book is identified as the most similar, whereas this nonfiction book about this parrot kakapo is identified as the least similar. So as you can guess, our vectorization method is being able to capture these content distances. And this is the whole full distribution of our content novelty measure. And as an example, one of the most novel content according to our measure is this book within the paranormal genre. The title is The Vegan Revolution with Zombies. And on the left-hand side, one of the least novel book content in our data set is this one, Chasing Harry Winston by Lauren Westberger, who is the same author of The Devil Wears Prada, because this book very closely just follows the typical trope of this young woman's career and struggle kind of narrative. Okay, so having this in mind, I wanted to go back to our focus on digitization. But we are here focusing on a comparison between two regional markets. One, the US market, the other, the European market. Why? Because when we say digitization, we are talking about here the Kindle ecosystem and the diffusion of the Kindle ecosystem. And interestingly, Amazon launched the Kindle in the US and the US only back then in 2008. And in Europe, the launch of the Kindle ecosystem was significantly delayed, at least for 6 years. And we are trying to use this gap to analyze our research question. So as a result of this staggered rollout of the Kindle ecosystem, this is the diffusion of the ebook market share in these two different regional markets. And if you follow the red line on the left-hand side of the graph, as you can see, the diffusion of ebooks, which represent the diffusion of the Kindle ecosystem, took off rapidly following 2008. On the other hand, the other European market didn't really see this type of increase in ebook market share or digitization that much. And there were two important reasons. First, this delayed launch of Kindle in Europe was because of this fixed price law a lot of European governments back then imposed. This restricted sellers like Amazon from arbitrarily adjusting their book prices. Whereas in the US, Amazon was able to lower their ebook prices dramatically compared to the physical book prices. It was their strategy to attract more users to their platform, which was very successful. But this type of pricing strategy wasn't allowed in most of European countries. Not only that, a lot of European countries imposed this much higher VAT rate for ebooks because they classified ebooks as electronically supplied services. So ironically, in many European countries back then, for the same book, ebook formats were more expensive than physical book formats, which was a huge problem for this digitization to sort of appeal to more and more consumers. So using this disparity, we take the US books as our treated group and European books as a control group to compare how content novelty sort of evolved in these two regional markets. And before we talk about statistical strategies and statistical results, this is just a purely transparent descriptive patterns of content novelty in these two regions. As you can see, until 2008, when Kindle was launched in the US, neither in the US nor in the European market, their level of novelty didn't really fluctuate much. But following 2008, as you can see, the level of content novelty in the US on average began to drop significantly, as you can see. And what was going on here? Our question here is whether this decline in novelty was statistically associated with digitization indeed. And the graph you are seeing right now here is exactly that. How much this decline in novelty was related to digitization. And it turned out the introduction of Kindle or the Kindle ecosystem in the US was related to at least a 2.2% decline in novelty. You may say, oh, wait, around 2% decline doesn't really sound like huge, right? But I want to draw your attention to the progressively increasing magnitude of the effect over time, as you can see here. And we don't have the ability to test after post 2015 period because of some systematic change in the Amazon's Kindle ecosystem, as well as the lack of our data. But given the trend of the declining novelty, we believe that the negative relationship between digitization and content novelty was getting larger and larger, which could be problematic. So now that we've established this negative relationship between digitization and content novelty, the next question we would like to ask is this: what drives this negative relationship? This could be driven by either supply or demand side drivers. On the supply side first, lowered entry barriers to the market, or diminished editorial processes in the publication process can impact this result. Because through this, the combination of this lowered entry barrier and diminished editorial process means traditional gatekeepers, such as publishers, publishing houses, or literary agents, or expert critics, they've been de-institutionalized. No one has to really closely work with them. No one has to conform to what they want you to write, because everyone knows you can always bypass traditional publication processes. So this could be one of supply side factors. On the demand side, we propose that there could be lowered returns from the consumer side, meaning that consumers may reward high novelty content as before. So from the producer's perspective or from the writer's perspective here, you don't see much incentives to keep pushing your, boundaries and then create something innovative. So I'm going to show you a couple of statistical results to see whether these predictions are in line with our data. First, on the supply side, I just mentioned that there could be important factors such that decreased entry barrier or weakened editorial process can have something to do with this negative relationship. And here, our focus first is on new entrant as opposed to incumbent authors. Because as a new author who want to make their debut, you can benefit from this lowered entry barrier compared to pre-digitization. Not only that, if you are self-published authors, you know that you don't need professional editors, you don't need this literary agent. But before digitization, you always had to send out your manuscript to literary agencies or publishing houses, waiting for them to make decision and over and over again. But these two types of market actors, new entrants or self-published authors, they may have something to do with this negative relationship. Let's check. This is just a regression table, but I'm going to skip the statistical details. Instead, this is our interpretation. The negative relationship between digitization and content novelty is stronger for self-published books and new or less experienced authors. But interestingly, which was surprising to us as well, this negative relationship still persists even for big publishers. When we say big publishers, not only just these big 5 publishers, but any publishers whose publication volume is significantly larger than self-published authors or independent publishers. So this means that this supply side mechanism cannot explain everything behind this phenomena. So we wanted to see whether there's any important demand side mechanism that impact this relationship under the hood. And here we propose that digitization may change how we search for and evaluate products from the consumer perspective. And this can in turn change the reward structure. And this may reduce sort of the incentive structure as well for authors to pursue more novelty. So to test this, we use very important two metrics that are derived from our Goodreads data. On Goodreads, similar to IMDb or Rotten Tomatoes, you can easily see a numerical metrics, including the number of text reviews on each book or the average star ratings on each book. And in addition to that, we also additionally collected New York Times bestseller status to see what kind of books after digitization are more likely to become a New York Times bestseller book. And this is the result. Again, skipping statistical details. The result in summary shows that as digitization increases, content novelty tends to be penalized more, as captured by the number of text reviews in Goodreads, as well as the average star ratings. In other words, as digitization increases, if you create something significantly novel, you will get lower number of text reviews. You'll get lower average star rating, which is a big problem to authors and to whoever tries to survive in this competitive digital publishing market. Although we don't find any statistically significant effect, we still find some directionally consistent effect for the New York Times bestseller status. Okay, so based on what we've presented so far, empirically and theoretically, here are a couple of things we think that are important. First, digitization disintermediates traditional gatekeepers. When I say traditional gatekeepers, like I said, traditional publishing houses, Penguin Random House, Simon & Schuster, and so on and so forth. And also literary critics, for example, book critics at New York Times or other professional experts who were supposed to actually read and rate newly published books every week or every day. So digitization deinstitutionalizes their roles, these conventional gatekeepers' roles, and instead it may reinstitutionalize digital or algorithmic gatekeepers, such as how these numerical algorithms compute your success metrics, how Kindle or how Goodreads actually combine all the consumer reactions on your book and then kind of present your performance or success every day in a very simple numerical number. So this may lead to more wisdom of the crowd. That's basically what algorithms do on these platforms, right? And these algorithms as a whole may shape and change the product landscape. And we believe this may lead to this decline in content novelty overall. Relatedly, a higher dependence on the digital ecosystem can shape strategic choices in response to this technological change. As we have shown, new entrants or self-published authors, we believe these market actors are more susceptible to this introduction of algorithms, the introduction of digital platforms, because they depend more on how these digital platforms work. Because otherwise, they have to go through all the traditional gatekeeping processes which they don't want. So higher dependence from these market actors on this digital ecosystem may have something to do with this mechanism. So bigger responses from these market actors, we think, have some significant effect on the decline in novelty. And we highlight how production strategies evolve in the face of digitization and generate practical implications for creative producers. We wanted to draw attention to the fact that digitization can change production strategies, like Manav said, not just in creative industries, but across many different industries these days. by changing both the demand and supply side dynamics. For many producers, creators, I mean, I know these days more than 40% of teenagers define themselves as content creators. So what kind of content you create doesn't matter. For them, it may be commercially wise to focus on derivative products that just cater to the mainstream, popular, or top-ranked content items on the platform, because that way you may have a better shot to be at least short-termly successful in the market. And I'd like to finish this presentation with this article that Manav briefly mentioned. This is a column in New York Times 2023. The least innovative, least transformative, least pioneering century for culture since the invention of the printing press. This is how this author here describes 2023. And I don't think it has changed much in 2025 either. And a couple of lines below, it also says, 23 years in, the shockingly few works of art in any medium, some albums, a handful of novels and artworks, and barely any plays or poems have been created that are on the similar level to the cultural and critical standard that audiences accepted in 1999. So this research has actually begun with a couple of personal thoughts I had, because, I mean, in my phone, I always have Spotify, all the other platforms, Goodreads.com, Kindle. But at some point, I felt like, oh no, I just don't have enough ability to actually find something new than what I just read weeks ago, months ago, years ago, what's happening. So I wanted to explore this personal research question into this academic question. And I hope our research with Manav actually can contribute to answering to this phenomena in some way. So thank you for listening. And then Manav and I will take more questions and try to answer as much as possible.
Thank you, Manav. Thank you, Khwan. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. It was really fascinating. We have a few questions in the chat. Our first question is from Hussein. Could it be that novelty should be dynamically normalized when measured? Should not the distance measure should be normalized as the space of vectors increase?
Okay, I think I can answer that. So that's a great question. So I didn't mention this, but we actually implemented this sliding window baseline strategy to exactly consider what you just mentioned. So it's actually way more complicated than I just described in the presentation. But I think you're spot on in that capturing novelty on a yearly basis is a huge challenge, because like you said, every year the baseline reference should be also updated, and you don't know, like in that specific year sometimes, like how many books are actually coming into the market at the same time. So we are trying to actually take into consideration all these different possibilities, but I'd love to hear more if you have a better idea, because this is something we are currently working on. But thank you for your question. It's a brilliant question.
Thank you, Khwan. Also, I think you can stop sharing.
Yeah, let me stop sharing.
Our next question is from Olivier. It's a great question. I think it's something we're all wondering. LLMs are going to make it even easier for people to write books and novels. Is it going to make it more difficult for original content to emerge?
Yeah, I'm happy to take this question. I think this is a great question, and like this is something that Khwan and I have thought about a lot. Like I think, yeah, I saw another question just came up from Hussein as well about this. You know, how might LLMs affect kind of the results that we see? We think our results are likely to be exacerbated by these kind of technologies, right? So like as LLMs come into the market, you know, the same kind of forces that we talked about that are pushing down the cost of producing these contents and that, you know, change how we search for and evaluate offerings will kind of push even further, right? And so there's still some unanswered questions of exactly how LLMs affect creativity. I think there's some really interesting research that study some of these things. People like Jackie Lane at HBS or Anil Doshi from UCL are studying these kind of questions and trying to understand, when LLMs can be more versus less creative. But we suspect this general force that pushes, costs down on the production side and kind of floods this market and leads to increase in quantification on the demand side are going to kind of continue to lead to these trends that we see, unless there's something kind of countervailing force put in place to stop them.
Thank you. Our next question is from Angelina Beck. Do you think the novelty punishment is a new dynamic, or has it existed even before self-publishing appeared?
I can take that question. It's such an important question. So the penalization over novelty obviously has existed ever since this kind of content creation existed in the human history. But my sense is that in the pre-digitization era, more often than not, traditional gatekeepers, if their vision is aligned with this novel content from the producer, they try to sometimes act as a creative shield to protect this innovativeness in the idea, in the content, and make sure this innovative content is being published after all these production processes. So we believe that penalization of novelty always existed, but then after digitization, we think the sort of like a protective tool from the traditional gatekeeper actually was reduced. And now a lot of creators and authors, in this case musicians, are just directly exposed to what the crowd wants from the algorithmic recommendation or from the kind of like a top 20 or top 100 ranks. So there's a little bit of a difference in terms of how this penalization can be sometimes protected or encouraged even. So yeah, let me answer that way. But thank you for the question, Adelina.
Thank you, Khwan. The next question is from an anonymous attendee. It seems that sequels, prequels, and revivals have become frequent in the past few years. Has it become indeed more frequent? If yes, would it be linked to the use of data and analytics to predict what consumers want? Great question.
Yeah, I think, I answered this in the chat. I think that's exactly what we think is happening. And I see Jean-David just asked a question that's quite similar, right? About how does the Amazon algorithm, do they privilege books that look previously successful? And, we think that is the case, basically. That's what's happening is, for as we are searching for books, it's really easy for Amazon to link us directly to things that we know that we would like, things that have a high likelihood of sorting out, right? Like if we love Harry Potter 1, 2, 3, we'll probably love Harry Potter 4, 5, and 6. So we think that does lead to, increased propensity for sequels, though we haven't looked at that empirically, but I think it's something that we are thinking that we might want to in the future. And two, yeah, we think that this can lead to books kind of clumping around successful prototypes. And I'll use this very quick opportunity to plug some of my prior research. I study digitization broadly, and I've studied this in the context of the music industry as well. And so one of the things that I've found in the music industry studying Spotify is that when big and successful artists release albums, other artists, their peers that are closely positioned next to them benefit. So like we see like this kind of weird competitive dynamic where, being closely positioned to these kind of tentpole, highly successful creators leads to, better performance in some of these settings. We think we're seeing some level of that manifest in the book industry as well.
Thanks, Manav. That was really good. We have a question from Richard. Why have you chosen the word novelty rather than creativity, which to me at least seems more appropriate?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So yes, so we wish we had the ability to actually capture creativity, not just novelty. But like Manav briefly mentioned in his presentation, novelty is one of the two important components that make up for creativity. Creativity, in other words, creativity requires two components. One, novelty, the other one is usefulness, or some people call it utility. So sometimes if you watch, let's say we talk about these sequels and prequels, in my opinion, a lot of prequels and sequels have a great function of usefulness or utility, because you already feel familiar with these Marvel films or other franchise films. So there's not much novelty, but it's fun to watch Fast and Furious. But when you say creativity, we need some level of novelty, or we need some level of innovativeness. More often than not, like as a researcher, we have a hard time actually measuring both dimensions. Sometimes because of the lack of the data set, or sometimes it's just because of the kind of like a lack of the access to the data set some companies may have. So in our case, in this context, we were not able to actually precisely capture the usefulness aspect of the content. Instead, we could capture more accurately the novelty aspect of the content because of this natural language processing algorithm we were using. So I just think you're making a great point that creativity may be actually a better term, and it's a much better variable we wish we could have actually captured in our research. But thank you for the question.
Yeah, I'll just hop on. I think this is a great question. I mean, these are things that I'll know that like researchers in our field really struggle with, because creativity is something that, we think many of us, like, we understand as lay people, but it's hard to kind of scale up and measure, especially for a large amount of data. So for other projects where we measure creativity, what we might do is have, a bunch of people read the content and tell us how creative they think it is, right? Like that's might be the best way we can do it. Because we're studying so many books, like Khwan said, like it's just not really feasible for us to have, hundreds of thousands of books read and analyzed. So in some ways, what was feasible for us was taking advantage of these natural language processing techniques to capture something that we felt was more, capturable with the actual data itself.
Thank you, Khwan and Manav. The next question's from Kanika. There are also external factors which inspire artists, which is prominent or trending globally. Do we exclude or normalize content scores produced during such external influences?
Yeah, I can briefly address this, and then Khwan, if you feel like you have anything to add, you can as well. So what we do is we account for, time variant effects. So like if you think that, so this year is not in our sample, but let's say books produced in 2020 might have looked very different with the pandemic happening and everyone, talking about pandemic related things. So in our empirical analysis, we control for the year. We're not controlling for more granular events, and this is for two reasons. One, in the context of the book industry, even with the rise of digitization, the process of getting a book published takes some time, right? So it's hard for us to, granular events that are happening in a week or a month, it's very hard to know like how to count them in the context of these books that take much longer to produce. Second is like, as far as we're concerned, the issue would be if there's an external factor that would confound with our measures of digitization. So let me put it this way, right? Like, so we have a measure of digitization that's based on the genre. So which genres are digitizing more or less. We would, for our results to be kind of biased by any of these external factors, we would have to have an external factor that affects, let's say, the romance genre, but doesn't affect nonfiction. Otherwise, it should kind of net out across our results. Similarly, with the analysis of US versus Europe, and maybe this is more feasible, it would need to be an external factor that affects the United States versus Europe. And otherwise, again, it would kind of net out. So we don't expect that to be a big issue in our results, but if there are specific things that you're thinking about or ideas or things that you think could come into play, we'd be happy to hear them and think through them a little bit more.
Thank you. The next question is from Hussein. Could you relate to how novelty space variance is affected by digitization?
It's a great question, Hussein, which actually we've tested, although we didn't include the analysis in the presentation today. So because this book content is being measured in 100 of factorized dimensions, it's very hard to simplify the variance measure in this case. But let's just try to simplify anyways. So let's imagine we are talking about sort of the radius of the content space. One thing we found is after digitization, the extreme radius has slightly increased, meaning that we have a little bit more extreme content or topics that we didn't really see much before digitization. But in most cases, unfortunately, this extreme content is being either ignored or doesn't really get any traction. So you can easily, on Goodreads, you can easily find some really, really random topics that you may think, who's going to actually read this and who's going to actually produce this content? But they do exist, at least on the Goodreads platform. But the thing is, if you check out their metrics, there's literally 0 review, 0 rating. It seems like no one cares. So I'm just saying that here, the variance itself, at least on the surface level, it has increased. But I'm not sure whether that variance actually means something to the market stakeholders.
Thank you, Khwan. Our last question for the session is from Ashish. Were you also able to further check if any lack of novelty in content storyline was compensated for by increased novelty in language?
Yeah, this is an excellent question. And I think this is kind of where the practical realities of what we can and can't measure limit us a little bit, right? So the novelty that we measure, as you rightly note, is about the content, right? The words and concepts used in these back cover book summaries, these descriptions. But that's of course like a limited way to measure novelty. And I think the way that we think about novelty that we can't capture is what we've called, like at least between us, stylistic novelty, right? So let's say you have 2 books, both written about the Battle of the Bulge in World War II. The back cover summary of both of those books could use very similar concepts and places and words, but one could be, a book that's epistolary, written like as letters between soldiers, and one could be a novel, right? And like those are extremely different stylistically, but our measure would capture them as being quite similar. So that's a limitation. We can't speak to it so much, and there's some evidence that suggests, I'm thinking of a paper by Cam Miller and Richard Wong that studies the book industry and studies travel books, and suggests that books differentiate in different ways post digitization, right? So maybe they find it's not helpful to differentiate in terms of content because people are searching for these kind of things, and the algorithms help us find these popular concepts. But they may find that the stylistic novelty, whether it's through this either kind of the format or, as you mentioned, kind of language, shifts a little bit. So it's a really good question. I would love to study it in a future project of Khwan, and I can think of a clever way to kind of capture it. But it's hard for us to speak to it empirically.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Manav and Khwan. Today's session was very insightful. If you have any final thoughts to wrap up the discussion.
I would just say thank you. I really, it's a pleasure for us to share our work, and these are really thoughtful questions. So yeah, thank you guys for your interest.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Bye.